It's outside, be outside in the sun for a couple hours screwing around.
Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar, which is our sixth webinar in the series Reducing Your Carbon Footprints, hosted by the Dayenu Circle at Temple Beth Emeth and co-sponsored with an interfaith group of congregations here in Ann Arbor. My name is Marcy Plunkett. I'm a member of TBE Dayenu Group. I'm hosting you tonight.
Boudin, there he is.
And a warm welcome to our speakers, Laura Robinson and Leah Wisty, and a special thanks to Kathy Marshall, who is our Dayenu chairperson and tonight's tech wizard. So if you have any technical questions, don't ask me, ask her. As you can see, our webinar will be recorded. So now Don Levitt from Climate Heroes and Dayenu Circle will tell us about the Climate Heroes project. This is a part.
Okay, thank you, Marcy. And this all goes back to Leah Wisty. So I'm glad Leah Wisty is here. We had our Dayenu group had a video conference with Leah Wisty a number of months ago. And Leah said that a survey showed that 44% of people in Washtenaw County never talk about climate change. And so we wanted to impact in that in some way. And we thought about video conferences, webinars, and we wanted to engage a broader audience. So we were able to engage a number of congregations who are part of the Climate Hero Stories Initiative. I want to list them: Temple Beth Emeth, St. Clare's Episcopal Church, the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor, Zion Lutheran, First Presbyterian Church, St. Francis of Assisi Parish, Beth Israel Congregation, and Blue Ocean Church. And so we're so grateful to have all of those partners for these webinars. And we do advertisements every other month in the Ann Arbor Observer featuring two climate heroes. Some of our climate heroes are on the call today. And this all is culminating in an event on May 7th at Genesis on Packard, which is where Temple Beth Emeth and St. Clare's share a building, called the first annual A2 Climate Teach-In from 1:30 to 5. We have Mayor Christopher Taylor as our kickoff speaker. We have Professor Shelley Miller as a closing speaker. We have 6 breakout sessions and a networking event, and it's going to be a knockout event. If you want to go to a website, that would be A2 Climate Teach-In, no hyphen between the word teach and in, a2climateteachin.com. And Kathy has put the link in there. So that's the background. Thank you very much, Marcy.
Yeah, thank you, Don. So I'm very excited by tonight's webinar. It's a bit different from what we've had so far, because so far we've focused on practical steps to reduce your carbon footprint, which of course is very, very important. But tonight we're going to step back and also look at an overarching question, which is, how should a conscientious and concerned person relate to the fact of climate change? Because with all the terrible news that comes out daily about climate change, one can easily feel overwhelmed and discouraged. And it's understandable that many people tune it out because they might feel helpless or anxious or frightened or angry, or don't know what's the most important action to take. And we're seeing a troubling rise worldwide in climate anxiety, particularly among young people ages 16 to 30. I'm sure many of you have seen that in your children or your grandchildren, or maybe in yourself as well. And it needs to be addressed if we're going to move forward. And we need guidance on how to have honest and useful conversations about climate change. Sometimes people may feel that they're not doing enough as individuals and feel guilty about that, which raises the question of just what is the purpose of individual action and what are its limits? So we're very fortunate to have 2 speakers here tonight who have thought a lot about these topics. Each talk will last half an hour, and when they're both through, we'll have time for questions after that. Our first speaker is Laura Robinson. a clinical psychologist in Ann Arbor with a specialty in climate-related work. She has a doctoral degree from Rutgers University Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. Laura will be talking about climate anxiety and other reactions, feeling our way through the climate crisis. She has spoken widely around the state and is also an activist who has testified in front of Michigan Senate committees. She is on the executive committee of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. Her private practice is called Humanity and Planet. In her free time, Laura loves hiking, exploring nature, travel that's nature-based and off the beaten path. I believe she was recently in Mexico, and being a parent. So now I'll turn things over to Laura.
Thanks, Marcy, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to share my slides so that we can get started. Okay, hopefully that's all up there. Just let me know if you're not seeing it correctly. So again, thanks to all of you for being here and for wanting to learn about this topic. I do want to take just a couple minutes here at the start. As Marcy said, my topic is really different from other talks in this series. So I do want to kind of run through a few important things just up front quickly. First, a heads up that some of the material in this presentation is not suitable for children. So just make sure if there are any kids around that they're out of earshot when you're watching, whether that's now or anyone watching the video in the future. Second, I want to just give a content warning that some data about suicide will come up briefly in my talk. So please consider not watching if you feel like that will put you at any risk at all. And last of all, and I share this at all talks that I give, including with professionals, the information that I'll be sharing in the first half of my talk can stir up heavy emotions for people. So as you're listening, please be sure to just check in with yourself, make sure you're taking good care of yourself emotionally. And toward that end, you know, I like to always remember that even though we're all on screens, we're here together, you know, supporting each other in community as we're learning tonight. So as we go over material like that can sometimes feel difficult to hear. And also we will end on an uplifting note. So please know that that will be coming as well. All right. In Drew Dellinger's poem, Hieroglyphic Stairway, which I shared in the links that will be shared in the chat, our future great-grandchildren ask us in a dream a poignant moral question. What did you do while the earth was unraveling? For me, choosing to work with climate change as a psychologist is one of my own answers to that question. Educating professionals and the public and being a climate-aware therapist are ways that matter tremendously to me in making a difference. But each one of us has an answer to the poem's question, a talent, a unique offering based on our own values that we can and we must bring to the fight for our planet. The irrefutable urgency of this situation and the profound seriousness of our warming world make this a monumental crisis. But within the darkness of any crisis is another psychological truth. As overwhelming and devastating as crisis is, within us is the capacity to mobilize, to find inner resources and strengths, and to change and grow. As a result, crisis can be an opportunity for transformation. Accessing our feelings about what's going on is part of taking us there when it comes to the climate crisis. So let's begin. The fact that you're here participating in this series tonight matters for at least a couple of psychological reasons. One reason is that you're standing up to the bystander effect, which is a psychological phenomenon by which people don't intervene in problematic situations because they think somebody else will take care of it. This is a really significant problem in encouraging people to take action on climate change because many people have mistakenly felt and still feel that our national and world institutions have everything under control and the rest of us can just wait the whole thing out. The bystander effect increases as the size of a group increases, which makes it staggeringly problematic for a population of 8 billion. But we also know from research that when people see other people act and thereby change the norms in a group, they're encouraged to take action themselves. So by acting, you make it more likely that others will too. Another reason it matters that you're here is because you're opening up discussion about climate change and the feelings around it. Climate change is rarely discussed interpersonally in the US. Every year, as Marcy mentioned, I think the climate change communication programs at Yale and George Mason survey climate beliefs and related ideas among Americans. And the latest data show that 64% of Americans are at least somewhat worried about global warming. But basically the same percent aren't talking about it. When worried people are reluctant to speak up because they don't realize that other people are as worried as they are, this can then become a self-perpetuating cycle of not talking about it as a society, as well as it makes people feel alone and isolated. That's problematic in and of itself, and it can also lead to inaction on climate change. Some people are starting to talk to the small but growing number of therapists like me who work in climate. For the first time this year, this survey asked whether people are seeking therapy to talk about their climate feelings. And 2% already are talking with the therapist, another 2% are interested, and 5% would probably be interested. So those numbers seem pretty small, but that's about 7 million people in the US alone already seeking professional help for climate change. So I'm first going to give you an overview of mental health effects globally, and then I'll focus in a few minutes to talk about climate emotions on an individual level. These are like really big and detailed topics, so I'm really just going to be skimming the surface tonight, but hopefully it will give you a good overview and kind of have a sense of what the whole topic looks like and be helpful in that way. Just to sort of lay the groundwork for that, I really want to emphatically say here up front that feeling upset about climate change is normal and it's psychologically healthy. It means that you are paying attention and it means that you care. There are times when feelings do get significant enough for people that they want to talk to a professional, or maybe they're affecting how they're functioning in life, and so they need to talk to a professional. And there's also trauma from climate change, which requires typically professional intervention as well. Unfortunately, professional intervention is not available to most people around the world facing climate issues because demand far outstrips supply. And in the US, the vast majority of mental health providers, 67%, according to a just released study, which was the first one to ever assess that, do not yet feel prepared to have a conversation about climate change with a client. So this is an area from a mental health perspective that needs to change. The most essential and obvious thing about the climate crisis is that it's a threat to our existence. That alone makes it a mental health issue. We are vulnerable, our ecosystems are being destroyed, things are accelerating, and it's completely understandable to be afraid and to have other feelings about it as well. The threat is not equal among everyone, however. Climate change is a multiplier that amplifies social, political, and economic problems like poverty and political instability, as well as systemic stressors like inequality and lack of resources to lack of access to resources. And that's true both in our country and worldwide. Parts of the world, like the global South, as well as groups of people who are marginalized and disadvantaged, already disproportionately bear the brunt of climate change and are expected to continue to. So this really makes this issue one of environmental and climate justice as well. In the US and the rest of the global North, climate anxiety, as Marcy mentioned, that term has become a buzzword in the past couple of years. And that increased awareness is really, really important. Professionally speaking, we often refer instead to the larger set of emotions collectively known as climate distress, which includes climate anxiety. But climate distress is not the only pathway through which climate change affects mental health, as you can see on this slide. And I have a lot of material, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to be reading all the lists that I have on slides. I'll just give you a chance to take a look at them as we go as well. These are all the different ways that climate change can affect mental health, with anxiety and distress being only one of them. To give you a sense of the scale, these are the mental health impacts from just one of the items on the previous slide, increased temperatures. If you look at the last two on the list, aggression and violence includes domestic violence, child abuse, and intergroup conflict, which includes civil war. Based on research findings, the incidence of suicide in the US and Mexico is expected to increase by thousands to tens of thousands by 2050. Events like wildfires, floods, heat stroke, displacement, migration, all of these can cause suffering and death or the risk of death. And that leads to trauma in direct survivors of climate-related catastrophes, as well as those indirectly exposed to those catastrophes. All right, moving on to emotions experienced from climate change. Climate change is heartbreaking, and it leads to feelings of grief, despair, depression, and hopelessness. Maybe some of these are familiar to some of you. In the interest of time, I just have the losses listed here, and I haven't gone into detail, but we can do that in the Q&A if there's interest in doing so, and learning more about what each one of those things means. People often experience solastalgia, and this is a concept that refers to the painful feeling of loss and homesickness for the home around you that has changed due to climate change. When people say, it's not the same anymore, I miss the way it used to be here, that's solastalgia. This comes up a lot locally with the warmer winters that we're having that cause people emotional pain, came up with the ice storms recently. I also see it with people I work with in other places where they've had to become accustomed to seeing smoke from distant wildfires, and their environment is just really different than it used to be. So this can be a really devastating feeling for people, feeling that things aren't going to come back to what they were. It's common, as Marcy mentioned too, for people to often feel guilt and shame about their contributions to global warming or about how they're having a hard time making a difference. Shame is paralyzing a lot of the time, and that's particularly problematic when it comes to climate change, because that, of course, keeps us from being able to think about how to make a difference and how to take action to save ourselves and the planet. On the other hand, many people are living unsustainably in a number of ways, but look the other way because it's genuinely hard for most of us to face or acknowledge some of the things that we're doing. So sometimes when we begin to really reckon with our environmental impact, feelings of guilt and shame arise. And sometimes those can be constructive and motivating as long as they are not felt too intensely in an overwhelming way. Regardless of how the guilt and shame is happening, it's important to have empathy for ourselves and to others and remind ourselves that we are living in the middle of infrastructure that can make it take a lot of effort to move from our society's default settings on fossil fuel use. And it's also really critically important to know that blame has been put on us as individuals in order to deflect blame from the fact that the larger world economy is built on fossil fuel consumption. That blame is not by accident, as you will see in the next slide. A lot of people don't know that big oil is like big tobacco. We've been made to intentionally feel individually responsible for causing and fixing climate change because of the highly intentional marketing campaigns of the fossil fuel industry. Internal company memos tell us that Exxon has known since 1977 that the industry was going to cause drastic climate change by burning fossil fuels. To deflect from their culpability and continue making profits, they made $4 trillion last year. They created marketing campaigns promoting the idea of energy efficiency, individual responsibility for saving the planet, and individual carbon footprints. None of which, of course, would matter at all if fossil fuels weren't powering our planet in the first place. And I just want to be clear, given the name of this speaker series, that the concept of a carbon footprint is totally valid. It refers to the emission of gases that contribute to global warming. It's the oil and gas industry's marketing it as an individual responsibility. That's the problem. Today, the industry continues to engage in lies and in greenwashing, which is the practice of pretending to be environmentally friendly when they're actually trying to continue what they've always done. And we know this from hundreds of pages of the most recent internal documents about this, which were released last year by the House Oversight Committee. So I like to tell people this when they're feeling guilt for what they cannot do on their own, and knowing that you're embedded in a system that has been manipulative, I think is important. And if you're like me, after you hear information like that, you might be feeling another common emotion around climate change, which is anger. A lot of people find anger motivating, and so if it's channeled in the right direction, it can be a great catalyst for action. The Yale study found that 47%, I believe, of Americans are reported feeling angry about climate change. Stress, anxiety, and fear are pervasive, of course, when it comes to climate change. Sometimes we use the term pre-traumatic stress disorder to describe what people are experiencing. These emotions can take many forms. Just to give you, a few examples: parents who are worried about their children's future, lots of people worried about their survival, either now or in the future, people feeling the stress of losing a home or of losing belongings, to floods, for example, as has happened in Detroit and other places in Michigan, being displaced, whether permanently from a home that burned down, a village where the water dried up, or even temporarily in the aftermath of severe weather. Even here in Ann Arbor and in Michigan, in the ice storm that happened, where 700,000 people were out of power for a number of days. Sometimes there's compromised physical health from climate, which then leads to stress. There's burnout for activists, scientists, environmental studies students, all of whom are working nonstop and feeling overwhelmed and often not being believed by the public or adequately supported. And adolescents distraught about the future, and lots more. In 2021, UNICEF reported that nearly 1 billion children live in one of the 35 countries most at risk from the climate crisis, and that by 2050, heat waves will affect almost all children around the world. Developmentally, events have a larger impact during the formative years when children's sense of security in the world and in others, as well as their sense of self, is being formed and shaped. Children exposed to disasters are less likely than adults to be able to cope with what they've gone through. And because they're reliant on others and don't have the power to change or avoid what's happening, their ability to cope is further decreased if they have stressed or unsupportive caregivers or are separated from their caregivers during the crisis. And of course, having stressed caregivers during a crisis is a pretty common experience. Chronic stress in childhood can cause lifelong issues, as you can see on this slide. In addition, child abuse is a consequence of climate change due to the increases in aggression and violence from rising temperatures and other reasons, like we talked about on the earlier slide. Studies have shown that families that are more vulnerable to loss of food and shelter after natural disasters commit violence against children more frequently. All kinds of child abuse are traumatic and absolutely devastating to a child's emotional development and mental health. So climate change in this way has the potential to affect a child for their entire life. Unlike those of us who are old enough to remember a world that seemed less threatened and less threatening, children and young adults now are faced with an entire lifetime of experiencing climate change. In December 2021, some well-known climate researchers published an extraordinary study of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds who were asked about their feelings and beliefs about climate change. And the next few slides represent data from that study. As you can see here, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all the slides. The numbers are really grim. And my experience with clinically with clients in this age range is very consistent with the data from this study. If you look at the brown rectangle on the right, you can see that only 5% of these 10,000 young people are not worried at all about climate change. 5%. still from the same study, looking at emotions that people are feeling, and very, disturbing and upsetting to look at these percentages. So looking now to a different sample, looking to adults here. At the top of the slide, this is an older sample, a median age of 48, and the sample was 82% white, so a very different population than that last study. And they found that 46% of participants were worried about climate change. At the bottom of the slide, going back to the Yale study, for some people, worry goes beyond just worry, of course, and becomes worse psychologically. So using diagnostic questions, the researchers found that 11% of people are nervous, anxious, or on edge. 9% can't stop worrying about global warming, and 9% also have some depressive symptoms related to global warming. Looking at racial differences in climate anxiety, Black Americans in this poll were the most likely to report anxiety over the impact of climate change, and Hispanic adults, Hispanic is their language, were next in line. This really speaks to the racial inequity and social justice aspects that we see in climate change. Environmental racism means that Black Americans are more likely to live in areas that are prone to flooding. They live near refineries and other polluters that damage air quality. And a 2020 study of over 100 US cities, including Detroit, found that many historically redlined minority districts comprise the hottest areas in the country. So let's move in now to how we handle all the emotions we might feel about climate change. There is lots more that we do in therapy to help people cope with climate distress, but this information is just kind of general information that anyone can use if they're dealing with some of these feelings. So first thing, talk about it. We know that talking helps when it comes to talking about climate change and in general. So talk about climate change. Use your voice in ways that matter to you, and also talk about your feelings about climate change, and do that with other people who understand, so that you feel less alone and more supported. It can feel really isolating if you're trying to talk to people who are not on the same page in terms of just where they are with their own awareness and ability to look at this. So there are a number of organizations that offer online groups. Some of them offer things in person, to come together with other people who care about the environment and climate change. And I included some of those in the links that I provided in case you're interested in those. Some of them also offer trainings and guidance on how to start your own groups. So it's something that if you wanted to start a group among friends or something like that, that can be a good way to learn how to do that. Know that feeling worried makes sense. I said this earlier, of course, but it bears repeating a lot to validate that your feelings are telling you something, and they're telling you that you care about our world. So accepting our feelings can often have the effect of making them feel a lot more bearable. Managing your media intake. This is a big one. Only a small percent of the news reported on climate is good. And that's, of course, because legitimately there's quite a lot of very bad climate news. But we also know from research that there is a negative bias in climate news, just as there is bias in the news in general in terms of just trying to grab our attention, with headlines. So, there's always going to be climate news. So you probably don't need to be following it constantly or even every day. So it's really important to take care of yourself this way. If you do need to stay connected with the news, like for whatever reason, maybe it's part of your work, something like that, you can set times of day where you're not going to look at it, and also make sure that you're doing lots of other sort of healthy things to counterbalance the effects of what you're taking in. And you can look for more positive news too. Climate journalists are starting to be more aware of this situation, and there's even a thing called solution-focused journalism because of this, and you can find more hopeful and still realistic news out there. So take a look around and you can definitely find it. So for young people or anybody else on Instagram or TikTok, there is often incredible support and incredible activism on there. One person on TikTok, I don't know if any of you saw this, but they got an entire movement going against the Willow Project recently, getting many, many thousands of signatures sent to the White House. So there's positive stuff going on, and you can see the care that people have, but it can get overwhelming. So it's just something to really keep an eye on and think about how you want to handle it. Calming our nervous systems. So our nervous systems get pretty amped up when we're feeling stressed out, as I'm sure you all are aware of. There are lots of different ways that you can regain your equilibrium, whether that's through mindfulness meditation or being mindful throughout your day at different points throughout the day. Exercising, including, like simple things like taking a walk, practicing calming breathing, or spending time on activities or hobbies that you enjoy. And for some people, being out in nature triggers climate distress. But if that is not the case for you, getting out in nature can be really calming and restorative. And spending time out there in nature decreases stress. We know from research, as well as, anyone who's done it can probably also feel that feeling themselves. And building a direct relationship with nature, if you don't have one already, can increase your feelings of connection with the natural world and the planet that you care about. Take action. Quite simply, taking action makes you feel better. So individual action on things that move the dial on climate, which is not everything that people do, but really the big things that move the dial, that matters. Because even though you're only one fish in this little school of fish here, there are other fish there too, all around the world, doing what you're doing, even though you might not know they're there. And remember what I said at the start about the bystander effect. Doing individual actions can absolutely change the norm in your social group or your community. So your actions do matter. We also know from pretty recent research that taking similar action, smaller actions on climate leads to taking bigger actions on climate. So starting somewhere is better than not starting at all. But this is the big but, while individual action is important, it is not enough. So bigger action is critical. When we come together with others, our actions are amplified and have a much, much, much bigger effect. People often wonder, how do I do that? And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if we want to. But in general, there are lots of programs in place that you can join to take action. And you can also create things on your own, be creative and think, what are some things that might be missing in your community or among your friends that could really make a difference. And as a bonus, when we join with other people this way, we strengthen social connections and we build community, whether that's around climate emotions or otherwise. So we feel better, and it helps our anxiety and stress, and we feel less alone. And last but not least, hold on to hope, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So talking with kids, I wanted to include a little bit about this because Marcy thought that this might be something that would be helpful for people to hear today. Providing hope while also validating kids' feelings is really important when you're talking with kids. Depending on their age and what they've been exposed to, a lot of even young kids know at this point about climate change, and they're worried about it. So it's important to hear what they're telling you and sort of understand what it is actually that they understand. And if there's something they're really off base about and they're really afraid because they're getting it wrong, you can tell them like, okay, this is what it really means. It's important to, again, hear that, but not minimize their feelings. And while at the same time, you want to use age-appropriate language and give them the safety and security of telling them that there are adults who are helping. That's a really big one. And you can think of the whole thing with Mr. Rogers, right? Sort of look for the helpers. It's really important to teach kids about that and to tell them that people are working on this. Young kids really deserve to be children, and and to not have to be burdened with problems that are well beyond their capacity to grasp or do anything about. So it's also really critical to protect them from any hopelessness or doom that you might be experiencing. One thing that kids often like, and that can also help sometimes with their feelings about climate, is joining you in climate-friendly family projects, for example. Older kids who are worried might want to know a little bit more about what's happening if they have exposure, for example, to the news or from school. Sometimes, depending on the school, it varies around the country. Sometimes climate change is not taught in a way that really takes care of kids' emotions. And a lot of times material is presented and it's a whole lot to handle and kids kind of don't know what to do with it. So that's something to also just be aware of. And again, with older kids too, it's important to give them hope, involve them in climate friendly actions, and emphasize there's time to change things. And lots of people are working on it all over the world. A couple other things about working with kids here. Younger children take things literally. So if they see something frightening about climate change or anything else happening on the news, they might feel that it's happening right here, right now, which scares them. So even older kids who don't take things literally can become really frightened by images in the news. So I think it's really important to shield younger children from frightening media content. And when they do see things, to help them understand that those things are not happening right here, right now. If things do happen right here, right now, then that's a different experience. And you want to really support them through it and let them know things are going to get better, even though something bad happened. Adolescents, whole different category, as we know from just looking at the data, right? Adolescents really feel it's their responsibility to save the world, since adults have not managed to do it so far. And they're pretty angry about it. Some have tuned it out because it feels like too much, or they've gotten cynical. So talking, if you can get them to talk about their feelings with you or other people, including perhaps in some of the groups that I mentioned, some of those have things for young people that can be helpful, and also encouraging them to connect it to bigger action, like taking political action, like voting, getting out the vote for others, things like that can be an important way for them to get involved if they're not already involved. Helping your kids develop a relationship with nature can also help ease worries. Cultivating a sense of wonder in nature is so important in childhood, and it gives kids mental space to just be. And that, again, helps them feel better. Kids are indoors so much these days and on screen a lot more, but unstructured play away from a screen is really essential to their development. And outdoors, of course, is the perfect place for that to happen. And also when it comes to climate change, people are more likely to protect what they care about and feel close to. And so helping children develop those relationships with nature now and, as much as possible helps them down the line, and it also helps the world. So going back to adults here, part of managing our climate emotions is entering into a realistic relationship with hope. So to be really clear, and using the word hope, I do not mean that I think climate change is any less dire or urgent or terrifying than it is. This is really a both and situation, not an either or situation. We can both feel the depth of our feelings about climate change and know how bad things are, and have hope that things can change. It's really hard work, as you already know, making systemic change, and we have to have hope to sustain us as we engage in that work. For a long time, hammering home the message of the dangers of climate change was highly effective in getting people to notice and realize how bad things are. But that approach did eventually lead some people to feel like there's nothing that can be done. And that's far from the truth. And it's also dangerous, because then what happens is people give up, or they tune out, believing that we are doomed. So you may have heard that referred to as doomism. And some are starting to say that that's become as dangerous as climate denial. And that's for the simple reason that it keeps us from acting on climate change. Doomism leads to narrative foreclosure. It stops the story. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if we do stop our involvement in the story right now, nothing will in fact change. But not only can we be involved in the story, our involvement can change the story. One way to think about that is the butterfly effect, which I'm sure you've heard of. It was discovered by a meteorology professor at Harvard in 1961, and it became a founding principle of chaos theory. And it's about the idea that nature responds to tiny changes in ways that we can't predict. And it's the whole idea of does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? In the unpredictability and chaos of large systems, we can choose to find hope that there may be things we don't know that might affect things positively. And another piece of hope, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of tipping points in climate change. Those are the points at which complex systems experience a shift that tips them into a cascade of irreversible, self-perpetuating consequences that then speed up the effects, the process of change. Many tipping points, of course, have been identified for climate change, some of which we've already crossed. But researchers and scientists are also developing and working on what they call positive tipping points for climate change. These are the opposite of the tipping points that we've been familiar with. Instead, these are things at the level of human society that can be done to set off reinforcing feedbacks that cause rapid decarbonization. So I find that something really hopeful. Some other heartening news is that it turns out that it's been found experimentally in the lab that there's also a tipping point for social change. That refers to the point at which a sufficiently large minority can change societal norms even after a population has come to a consensus. So what they found in a study in Science, they found that about 25% of people in the study were able, once they reached 25%, they could tip the opinion of the majority to that of the minority. So even there's a lot to learn still there, it gives me hope that this exists. Coming up here, just a few more minutes and I'll be done. I talked at the start about the climate crisis being a chance for transformation. Scientists have made it clear that we are past the point of being able to take incremental change and that we do, in fact, need large-scale transformative change. There are some, of course, who believe technology will be the entire answer, but many scientists believe that engineering cannot dig us out of the hole that we're in, that instead we have to change the way our social world and our global economy function. And although technology will no doubt need to be part of the solution, it does have its own significant mental health drawbacks, including the environmental equity and justice issues I mentioned earlier. Just one example, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday by an African climate scientist who was writing about the risks of environmental manipulation and the way that geoengineering, as he says, diverts attention and investments from building renewable energy and other climate solutions in Africa. So consumption and continuing business as usual can be a society's psychological attempt to avoid anxiety about what's really happening. But instead of continuing a global system of intense stress where we're disconnected from each other and keep constantly over-consuming and overdoing and then trying to compensate for it, there is an alternative. We could get off the global hamster wheel and collectively change how things work from the inside out. Reflecting on and listening to our emotions about climate change instead of running away from them can guide us in that direction. Reflecting on that possibility and working on bringing it to life is one way we can develop a psychologically and emotionally healthier civilization. And engaging in meaning-focused coping, realistically acknowledging a long-term threat and finding our inner strengths and values that give us meaning as we cope with it is part of doing that as well. In the climate arena, here are some of the ideas that circulate when we think about envisioning a world like that, that's on a different path from the one we're on now. A new world that instead is built on a culture of what psychoanalyst Sally Weintraub calls a culture of care. It's one that's sustainable and regenerative, has a circular economy, is morally and ethically just, and is humane and compassionate towards current and future generations of the human and more than human worlds. The more than human world is a concept from the eco-philosopher David Abrams, and it refers to, the worlds that are not human, animals and nature. So while our feelings about climate change are wholly understandable, being led by our fears can sometimes make us more anxious or frantic, or make us keep spinning on that hamster wheel. So instead, while accepting the heartbreak of what's happening, we can hold our own and others' fear with compassion and choose to let a positive vision of the world we want guide our action. So I encourage you to imagine and to sit with what kind of world that would feel like, and then to use that feeling inside of you as the foundation for your action. This is called world building when writers and artists do it on the page or canvas. So working together, we must and we can create a paradigm shift, and we can be the catalyst to call for and create systemic change and put our damaged planet back together. It is up to us, but together with imagination and action, I know that we are up to the task of answering our great grandchildren's questions in a way that's meaningful and that made a difference. Thank you so much. I will stop there and end my slides.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. We're going to hold the questions till after Leah speaks. So we're going to move right ahead. Leah Wisty, our next speaker, is the Executive Director of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, a nonprofit based in Detroit. It's part of a national organization whose mission is to inspire and equip people of faith and conscience of all backgrounds to be better stewards of the earth and to mobilize for protecting the planet, and in particular, protecting those people most harmed by climate change. If you take a look at the website of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, you'll see that they do a dizzying array of fantastic activities, from helping congregations become more energy efficient to promoting and guiding climate conversations within congregations. Leah is a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology at UC Davis. In her free time, she enjoys, and I quote from the website, weeding the garden, buying more books than she will ever read, and trying not to get electrocuted, renovating her house in Detroit's North End. Leah's talk is entitled The Role and Limits of Individual Action. Okay, Leah, you're on.
Okay, thanks so much for that nice introduction and for all that grounding, Laura. I wonder, before I start sharing my slides, I would just love to hear like where folks are at in the room. Like that was a lot to take in. So what are you feeling? And I just encourage you, you could go off mute and maybe say one word about how you're feeling or a couple of words, or feel free to drop it in the chat. I want to make space for everything that comes up when we talk about that stuff.
Thank you for offering that, Leah. I appreciate that. It's a really important thing to do.
So I'm seeing Patricia says, grateful for any hope.
Perseverance.
Perseverance. Who else? Scared. Yeah, I feel like I'm not the only one with those feelings, some sense of not having to be alone in that discomfort. Still hopeful. Yeah, okay, thanks for sharing. And you can continue to pop those things in the chat if you like. All right, I'm gonna get my slides up here. Here we go. All right, so I'm talking about the role and limits of individual action. Cautiously optimistic, I also see in the chat. Thank you so much. All right, and I'm sort of looking off here to the screen, off to the side, because I have a second screen that's going to help me through this. So just a quick introduction about my organization and of me so that you know who you're listening to for the next little while. So Michigan Interfaith Power and Light was founded as a part of a religious response to global warming about 20 years ago. And we have a couple hundred member congregations across the state. As Marcy mentioned, we're based in Detroit, but we've got folks in the UP and the West Side and Ann Arbor, and they come from all different traditions and denominations. And we do a bunch of different things. So a couple of years ago, we went to northern Minnesota to protest the Line 3 pipeline, right? Operated by Enbridge, which also operates the Line 5 pipeline that we are also dealing with here in Michigan. And this is me. So grew up spending a lot of time in nature, especially in northern Wisconsin. I chased this bullfrog around the lake for what felt like forever until I finally caught it. I always wanted to kind of see and touch and be right up close with the natural world around me. And I've been working at Michigan IPL coming up on 10 years. And you know, which is wild, right, Kathy? And Kathy has been with us for part of that time, and we've been friends for most of that time. Yeah, and in that time, like, climate has become kind of one issue that I was concerned about to kind of the biggest issue that I was concerned about. And I also notice in my time at Michigan IPL, the way that we've talked about this issue and the way we've invited people to take action on this issue has really changed in that 10 years, right? Initially, it was kind of hard to point to local climate impacts. And now 10 years on in Michigan, it is not hard to find climate impacts, right? We had this big ice storm where, you know, disinvested infrastructure meant a really, you know, met up with a really powerful storm and knocked a lot of people off of the grid for days. Folks were without power for 9 days, right? And we've had floods and we've had these impacts, right? So that changed how we've talked about it. I also want to mention my faith identity, since right, I'm talking with folks from a Dayenu circle, and I kind of change how I talk about this over time and with different audiences, but the way I'll describe it to you now is that I'm a recovering Catholic, and I'm also kind of spiritually eclectic. So I grew up in a tradition that I didn't really feel nourished by, right? And I'm going to kind of circle back to that later. But a gift of this work at an interfaith organization is that I get to contact all kinds of different traditions and wisdoms and ways of relating to spirituality, right? So that is pretty cool for me. So this question of what can I do, right? It's the most common question. It's where a lot of people start, and it can be really overwhelming, right? This is a screenshot that I took today that shows there are 1,620,000,000 results for the question, what can I do about climate change? Overwhelming, right? Impossible. How could you wade through all of that, right? It's too much. So what I thought I would offer, and after having talked to Marcy and Kathy about, hey, what does your group need? What do they need to hear from me? I decided to structure my remarks in this way, right? I'm going to offer something I'm thinking of kind of as climate action wayfinding, and I am not going to give you, you know, some list of tips and tricks for green living. If you want that, you can find it elsewhere. But I'm going to invite you into, I'm going to give you some ideas, some concepts that you can use to chart your own courses of action. Okay, so also, I want to say I've never exactly given this kind of talk before, so you might hate it. It might not work, and so we'll see how it goes. But I covet your feedback. I'm gonna start with a story, and it may be familiar to some of you, but this is something that I heard from a Jewish colleague of mine who leads the IPL in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's a story of, or a teaching of, a coat with 2 pockets, which comes from the Polish rabbi Simcha Bunim, who is Polish. And so he says, we have this coat with 2 pockets, and each of the pockets has a message in it. One of them says, the world was created for me. And one of them says, I am but dust and ashes. 2 very different messages, 2 contrasting messages. And he's suggesting that both of these things can be true at the same time. So maybe sometimes we need that message of the world was created for me. I am special and empowered and a child of God, right? And maybe sometimes we need the message of humility, right? I am dust. I am of the earth. I will return to the earth. So I am inviting you into this conversation by inviting you into this paradox of kind of two contrasting ideas, right? And those contrasting ideas related to this topic are that individual actions matter, and also the sum of our individual actions will not end climate chaos, right? And both of these things are true at the same time. And I totally wish I could just tell you that if everyone recycles and uses their canvas tote bags, we are going to solve this. But it's unfortunately not the case, right? We need to transform systems and challenge power and move from an extractive economy to a regenerative, caring economy, right? Where sacredness is valued. All right, so one perspective on individual action that you might have heard before. This is Bill McKibben together with Michigan IPL's founder, Father Charles Morris, when Bill McKibben was in town in 2009. So Bill McKibben, he's got this article that kind of goes around from time to time. I've shared it before with our networks. And he says, in response to this question, what can I do? He says, it is almost the right question. The question needs to be, what can we do? Right? And he says, okay, the most important thing you can do is to join with your neighbors and organize. That's the first most important. The second most important thing you can do is join with your neighbors and organize. We need you to organize, right? This is his message. And then later in the article, it goes on to say, and then if you still have time, by all means, get those LED light bulbs, put those solar panels on your roof, drive an electric car, do all the things, right? But the first thing you need to do is organize. Okay, so this one perspective, sometimes I am like, yes, we just need to stop worrying about, right, all of the very small ways that you and I can make an impact. And we just need to focus on organizing, but I think that's not really where a lot of people are coming from, right? And so it might not be the most helpful place to start. And so I come back to this, right? That living our values through our actions, right? Through our day-to-day actions, it feels good. It feeds our spirit. It's a way that, you know, so many people, when they think about what can I do about climate, they want to start with the individual actions, right? And that action can be an antidote to despair. So what I'm going to talk about going, you know, in the next 20 minutes or so is like some ideas that can help you figure out what does that action look like, and how can you build on what you can do as an individual and parlay it into something that can have a bigger impact. Here's the first idea. I've got 5 ideas I'm going to share with you, and I'll skip one if we don't have time. I'll also follow up with these slides by email. I'll share them with the organizers. 3-legged stool is a concept you can use. Okay, so and this comes from our friends in Minnesota, from Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. But they say, all right, effective and life-giving climate action can be thought of in terms of a 3-legged stool. So we do the practical local actions. We do actions that are going to change, like that are spiritual and relational. And then we do actions that are going to transform our social and our systemic situation, right? And I'm going to give you an example of like, what could all of these things look like? The example I'll use is creating a rain garden. And I also want to say, like, this is just something you could do. This is not a thing you should do, right? Necessarily, right? And we'll get to how do you identify the thing that you want to do later on. So you've got a rain garden, and this is the practical local action. It's going to have 12 varieties of native plants. And it diverts stormwater. I don't know if you experience this in Ann Arbor. We do in Detroit. When it rains really hard, we've got puddles, we've got streets that are flooded, basements are flooded. So diverting the stormwater, like allowing it to slow down and seep into the ground and not all go into the sewers, is really important. And it's really important for local water quality, right? But also this garden that you're making, it supports pollinators who have been endangered by habitat loss, like lawns, like development, like the use of chemicals, and who have been endangered by climate change, right? Here are some of the practical pieces of what a native rain garden can achieve. Okay, now these are some like spiritual and relational actions that you might do connected to a rain garden, right? You could celebrate it with friends. You have some folks over, you have, some tea in the garden, you enjoy the natural beauty, you enjoy each other's company. And as this garden matures and develops, it is beautiful. It's low maintenance. It helps manage the stormwater. It attracts butterflies and birds, and it sparks the interest of people who walk by, right? And maybe they ask you about it, and that is a vehicle for you to get to know some of your neighbors who you didn't know before. And maybe you can help them with it, right? You can tell them, hey, this is where I got these plants, right? This is my source. Or maybe you help them design it, or maybe you are such a mensch, you actually help them dig up their grass and put the native plants in, right? You could help them in all kinds of ways. And you yourself are enjoying this space for your morning coffee, to connect with nature, to meditate, whatever you want to do. Maybe you've got these new plants you've not worked with before. You learn about their medicinal properties. You're like making tea out of the nettles you planted, right? And it's helping your immune system. Maybe it sparks your interest in reading something like Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? Which is a kind of indigenous perspective, like from a scientist who's trained in a Western tradition, but also grew up in an indigenous tradition, right? And kind of marrying those two worldviews, right? And that kind of helps you start seeing, again, this phrase, the more than human world, in a different way, possibly, right? This could go in all kinds of directions. Here are some thoughts. Okay, and lastly, the social systemic piece, right? Maybe you register your garden as a certified pollinator habitat, right? And you get this sign from the National Wildlife Federation, and it has a website that people can visit to learn more, and people start learning about it and they start practicing. And soon you've got a whole neighborhood full of these rain gardens that also serve pollinators, right? And perhaps you are then now working with your homeowners association or the city that you live in, because they've got these crappy ordinances on the books that say your grass must be 6 inches or lower, and you can only have, whatever, right? Kind of built around all of these kind of middle-class norms that are not very sustainable, right? And so you change some systems, right? And you demonstrate the ecosystem services that this beautiful garden provides. And perhaps people start to cultivate a different sensibility about what's beautiful and what they might like to have in their space. You could host a film screening and talk about it with your friends, your neighbors, right? There's a film called The Pollinators, right? And it connects pollinators, their issues to like how critical they are to our food chain and how vulnerable they are given climate impacts and given the toxicity of industrial agriculture and landscaping, right? You might talk to local officials about this. You could seek media attention, and you could write an op-ed about why you're doing this. Why does it matter? Right? So it could look all kinds of different ways. That was kind of a lot for one section. I know there will be time for Q&A. And like I said, I'll follow up with the slides. So here's a concept that's a little more bite-sized, but it also goes together, right? And that idea is make it irresistible, right? Whatever you decide to do. Oops, it looks like I got cut off a little bit. But so this is you might have heard this quote before: the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible. And I am going to invite you to make climate action irresistible to yourself and to the people around you. Because I think for such a long time, like, the environmental movement has been very scolding. And I shared with you a little bit about the religious, my experience of the religious tradition that I grew up in, which was very much about, don't do this, it's bad to do that, you absolutely must not do this thing, right? And I think that is not a very compelling invitation, right? When we are trying to build a movement, and it doesn't feel good to us either, right? So you notice the difference here between, like, don't litter, don't eat meat, don't use single-use plastics, don't drive a Hummer, blah, blah, blah. That lands very differently than, right, this beautiful, inviting climate action of creating a rain garden or something, right? So make it irresistible. That's the second idea. The third idea is look for opportunities to invite others in, right? Whether that is something as simple as, you just made this beautiful garden and you're going to invite people to come and hang out there, right? Or whether that's like, hey, I'm going to go talk to my lawmaker. Do you want to come with me? Have you ever talked to a lawmaker before, right? We can go together and have an impact, right? Of course, the young Alec Baldwin is a great role model for this, right? You might recognize that from Glengarry Glen Ross. Okay, idea 4, we're in the home stretch. This is another tool. This is a tool for discernment, and it comes from Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. But so she suggests, of this, more than 1 billion results on what can I do about climate, here's a way of kind of narrowing it down. So you can ask yourself, what brings you joy? You can ask yourself, what are you good at, right? And that also includes, like, maybe that includes like your networks, your relationships, right? Avenues that you have for power and making change. Maybe you've got a friend on city council. Maybe you've got this massive bank account and you could do amazing things with it, right? Who knows what that looks like? And lastly, what's the work that needs doing, right? In this realm of climate solutions, what is most critical? And this is something that I think is also important for, the audiences I talk to understand, is that, like, these opportunities look differently based on where you are, right? So the stuff that's happening for me in Detroit, it's not totally different from what you're experiencing in Ann Arbor, but it's a bit different, right? And so the opportunities for action are going to be different, which is another reason I couldn't show up today with this beautifully constructed list of, here are all the right things to do where you are, right? Because you need to bring your own passion, skills, and knowledge of what's happening locally to bear there. I mean, here are some things that might need doing in Ann Arbor from my perspective, right? You have an awesome sustainability director for your city, and Missy Stultz, who's, so smart and making it happen. And there's this, like, whole thing around municipalizing the utility and having a local power company that's actually accountable to local people. I mean, that's amazing. That would be such a cool thing to get involved in if I lived there, right? For me, right? I think, Ann Arbor also has a lot of, wealth and knowledge and all of these things that can be used to bring resources towards those who are harmed first and worst by pollution, by climate impacts. I also think, like, fossil fuel divestment is a really important thing, and that's something you can do personally. It's something you can prompt the institutions that you're connected with, maybe your synagogue, to consider, right? Like, those are big and really impactful things. Of course, the University of Michigan is also having this conversation, right, about divestment. I think they announced that they were committing to doing that, right? A resource here is the Just Transition Framework. I don't have time to go into it, but it's something you could check out. It's this very holistic kind of framework for like, how do we move from this extractive economy that's built on colonialism, white supremacy, militarism, to an economy that is regenerative, that honors sacredness, that includes caring for all of the members of the web of life. So you can follow that link later, perhaps. Last idea. And this kind of ties back to the psychology of, you know, dealing with the climate crisis, but I think it's so critical that we are cultivating imagination, right? Thinking really broadly and creatively about what climate solutions could be where we are, that we're tolerating this feeling of uncertainty. I want to try something big and bold and ambitious, and I don't know if it's going to work, right? And also the ability to experience grief. I think to engage with this issue, that is a core competence that we need. I ran into this notion the other day, the idea that apathy is a form of the inability to feel grief. And so I think being able to experience grief, find the support we need to move through grief, is a really critical thing in this moment of climate crisis. And of course, community, spirituality are also sources for support. These are the 5 things I've covered. You'll get the slides after. You don't need to remember all of this stuff. And I'm just inviting you all to connect with me and with us at Michigan IPL, if that, you know, sounds good. And that's my last slide. I will drop this URL and my email address in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Leah. Can everybody hear me? Okay. This has been incredible, Leah and Laura. These have been extremely thought-provoking and inspiring talks. And I think we've all learned something, that they're probably filled with many emotions right now, but also I want to say there are also so many opportunities for people to get involved. And there's a book that just came out with a title that says it all. It's called Not Too Late by Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young. I can't pronounce her name well, Lutanat Tuba. Anyway, changing the climate story from despair to possibility. So we have to acknowledge all the emotions, but then get involved, and getting involved with other people, as Leah said, is particularly helpful, and make it fun and make it meaningful to yourself. And we certainly invite everybody who wants to get involved with us. There's plenty to do. Okay, now we have time for question and answer. We want to stop at 9 o'clock because we do find people start to go to sleep after that. So if you have any questions, please, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat to everyone. Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to you both for such excellent and thoughtful talks. I have a question to Laura. Laura, in talking to individuals about their climate concerns and worries, is there an interaction with political concerns, especially what's happening in the country right now?
Yeah, and just so I'm understanding your question, when you're saying, are there any, are you talking about how it interacts with political concerns in terms of who might come in to talk about this, or that
it interacts, and this leads me to feel in such and such a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, you know, I think it's interesting, right? There's the political part of this and the way that things have been going in our country for a while, right? There's the whole idea that so much of this is connected. And I think that that's kind of unavoidable. And so I think that, yes, people do come in, if I'm understanding you correctly, you know, people definitely come in sort of with this connection between all of these things, sort of the political process, our issues with democracy, all of the sort of systems not, you know, working the way that we hope that they will work, right? So feeling a lot of destabilization, which the climate crisis brings all by itself. But when you put all of this together, these interconnected systems, it feels really destabilizing. You know, to speak to like the other piece in terms of who might, you know, seek therapy and things like that. You know, I think I actually don't know the data on that. I guess, I don't know if that data has been collected, maybe it has, but, you know, I think it's an interesting question to think about. Yeah. Who is coming in and feeling that and being able to talk about it. And I don't know. I know that I have a mixture of people myself, but certainly you tend to get people who are more, you know, who are more thinking about this on a regular basis as something that really concerns them. But sometimes people, you know, are starting to develop awareness and they need a place to talk about it. And they don't have a community to talk about it. And so it's providing that too. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, Don, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Marcy. One of the slides referenced Bill McKibben, and Bill McKibben says something like, what can I do as an individual? And Bill McKibben says, what you can do as an individual for climate change is to stop being such an individual and start working collectively with others, with your neighbors, as the slide said. Now, I'm using that sort of as a promotional opportunity for this May 7th event. We're going to have 20 local organizations around the perimeter of the social hall, each staffing a table, so you can walk and talk to these different organizations. Because when I hear Bill McKibben say, well, work with other people, I say, well, who? How? And I know that there are these other organizations in Ann Arbor, but I don't know much about them. I don't know what they do. I don't know who they are. And this is an opportunity to meet these people. It's the only opportunity in such a condensed way to meet these people. So I think that is a critical point to align with others. It's not so easy to do, and that's an opportunity. So that's sort of a path forward I wanted to share.
Thank you, Don. Okay, see, Tim, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. My question is, or my comment is to Dr. Laura Carter Robinson. Really great presentation and covering so much area. And I really enjoyed the ending on a hopeful note. The question, the one thing that did stick out to me was that one statistics that said like 25% of people can lead to change. I've also heard in Christiana Figueroa's book, The Future We Choose, that there's a 3.5% rule about nonviolent protest of a population has not failed to lead to that change. So that's another really encouraging statistics that I want to share. Is that something you've heard about? Is there some discrepancy between the 25% and the 3.5? I know based on the way it's stated that the 3.5 rule is more engagement from that percentage of people, because you're doing a nonviolent protest versus being, in favor of a change. But any comments on that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a really great question. And I think that here, hang on, I'm just going to change my gallery view here. Basically, I don't know sort of what the in terms of looking at the differences between those, what those are. In terms of, the one thing that I mentioned was sort of done in a lab setting. It was kind of it's sort of a figure that's quoted White a lot, and sort of people have really, I think, hung on to it because it is a really hopeful thing. But the 3.5% that you're talking about, I think, it's really important because what you're talking about there, right, is really engaged action in a protest kind of way and nonviolent, like you said. And we know that makes a difference, and it makes a difference on a lot of fronts. It's a way that people can get engaged, to really take action and really join with people. So psychologically, it's really important. I don't know, kind of, I think that's a really hopeful thing to think about, that 3.5% of, of that kind of action has never failed to make a change. I think it speaks to the need for all of us to get out there and to in fact do that. Sometimes we think, oh, what is the point of going out there and marching, but it matters. It really matters. And it sends a message. And so I think it's important. I don't think I'm getting to your whole question there, but I think that's really important. And I'm glad you asked it. And I'll be interested in learning more about that as well, that 3.5% piece.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think you covered most of it. So that's an interesting thing. Maybe even a more hopeful thing to even if you incorporate it once you know more about it, that, because 3.5, 25% sounds pretty daunting, even if it isn't a majority, but 3.5 is really within reach in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. I would love to hear, I don't know if you can drop it in the chat, if you have like an author on that. If you don't, I can look it up, but if you do.
Yeah, I was just looking through the references, and I'll try to drop it in the chat.
Okay,
Thanks.
awesome. Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? Or a comment? Well, then I think we're ready to wrap things up for tonight. Again, thank you, Laura and Leah, for the wonderful, wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. And for everybody who joined us here tonight, showing your interest and support. And that's the way to combat this climate feelings and climate inactivity, is to gather together with other people. And I know before we end, Kathy, you wanted to add something about upcoming events?
Yeah, just really briefly, Don mentioned the teach-in on May 7th. It's been in the chat a few times. Hopefully you can attend that. Also, we have one more workshop in the series. It's on green investing. So, Leah, I can't, was it Leah or Laura? Now I'm not remembering. Which one of you talked about disinvesting from fossil fuels? Anyway, maybe it was Laura. Whatever. So, Leah.
It was Leah. I got the photo.
Okay.
Yes, it was Leah, but I have to say I completely agree with it.
Okay. Well,
I
anyway,
support that.
we've got a great group of speakers scheduled for that. I just dropped the link in the chat for the Climate Heroes event page, and you can register on that page if you're interested in that. So thank you so much. The speakers, as Marcy said, were fantastic, and we truly appreciate your time and everybody coming out tonight.
And thank you, Marcy, for putting it together.
Yes. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Great.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
really appreciate you doing this, Marcy, and having the vision to put this together and to sort of, I think Leah and I have these two talks really went together really well, and it's due to how you were thinking about it, Marcy, and putting it together. So I really appreciate it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks
All
all.
right, thank you and good night.
Yeah.